March 8, 1945. The muddy ground of the prisoner camp outside Frankfurt was still frozen in patches, and the German women walked barefoot through the slush, their feet bleeding and swollen. Then, an American soldier looked down at his own boots and made a decision that would change everything. The German female prisoners had been told that American soldiers would strip them of everything they owned. But on a freezing March morning in 1945, these same soldiers began doing something that contradicted every piece of propaganda the women had ever believed. What happened next would not only save feet and lives, but completely transform how both sides viewed each other. The German women had been taught that Americans were heartless occupiers. They were about to learn something very different. Make sure you're subscribed because this story gets even more powerful. The journey had begun 3 days earlier, on March 5th, when Allied command ordered the evacuation of a temporary detention facility near Kassel. The facility, originally designed to hold 200 prisoners, had swelled to nearly 400 as German resistance collapsed and more women were captured from various military support roles. These weren't combat soldiers, but nurses, radio operators, supply clerks, and administrative staff who had kept German military operations functioning behind the front lines. The order came suddenly. Allied intelligence had detected German counteroffensive movements in the region, and keeping prisoners so close to potential combat zones posed unacceptable risks. The women were given 30 minutes to gather whatever possessions they could carry and form into marching columns. No vehicles were available for transport. Every truck, jeep, and wagon was needed for moving combat troops and critical supplies to the rapidly shifting front lines. The march route covered 42 miles through the Hessian countryside, terrain that alternated between muddy farm roads and frozen forest paths. Under normal circumstances, such a journey would have been challenging but manageable for healthy, well-equipped individuals. But these were not normal circumstances, and the German women were far from well-equipped. Most of the prisoners wore whatever shoes they had been captured in weeks or even months earlier. Some had sturdy work boots that had held up reasonably well. Others had only thin leather shoes designed for office work, never intended for long-distance marching. A significant number had nothing but cloth slippers or shoes with soles that had already separated from the uppers, held together with scraps of wire or string. The first day of the march had been merely uncomfortable. The weather was cold but dry, and the roads, though rough, were passable. Women helped each other maintain pace, and the American guards allowed frequent rest stops to prevent exhaustion. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 15 miles and were given shelter in an abandoned farm building where they could rest until dawn. The second day brought disaster. A late winter storm swept through the region, bringing freezing rain that turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to be miserable, but warm enough to melt the remaining snow into treacherous slush. Women who had started the march with inadequate footwear found their shoes literally disintegrating beneath their feet. Leather soles, already worn thin, separated completely from the uppers. Cloth shoes dissolved into useless rags. Even relatively sturdy boots began failing as stitching rotted and seams split under the constant assault of water and mud. By the end of the second day, more than 50 women were walking either barefoot or with feet wrapped in torn pieces of cloth that provided almost no protection. The American guards, most of whom were young soldiers barely out of their teens, watched this deterioration with growing concern. Corporal Michael Stevens from Oregon had been assigned to manage the rear column, where the slowest and most struggling prisoners walked. He found himself constantly calling for rest stops as women collapsed from exhaustion and pain, their feet too damaged to continue without brief recovery periods. Private Tommy Chen, whose family had immigrated from China to California before the war, marched alongside the column's left flank. He had joined the army partly to prove his American loyalty after enduring discrimination even from his own countrymen. Chen prided himself on following regulations precisely, believing that perfect adherence to military protocol was his path to acceptance and respect. But the sight of women leaving bloody footprints in the mud tested his commitment to regulation over compassion. Sergeant David Morrison, a veteran of the Normandy landings who had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes, led the front of the column. Morrison had developed a protective attitude toward these prisoners, viewing them not as enemies, but as unfortunate civilians caught in circumstances beyond their control. He had a younger sister back in Detroit, and every time he looked at the struggling German women, he imagined his sister in their place. By the evening of the second day, the situation had deteriorated from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. The abandoned warehouse where they sheltered for the night offered protection from wind and rain, but the concrete floor was bitterly cold. Women with exposed feet developed alarming symptoms overnight. Several woke with feet so swollen they could barely stand. Others showed the telltale white patches of frostbite beginning to damage tissue. The morning of March 8th revealed the full scope of the crisis. Medical inspection by the column's 2 American medics identified over 70 women with serious foot injuries, burns from frostbite, deep cuts from rocks and debris, infections setting in from open wounds exposed to contaminated mud. The medics, overwhelmed by the scale of the problem and limited by their meager supplies, could do little more than wrap the worst cases in bandages and recommend rest that military schedules could not accommodate. The final leg of the journey stretched ahead, another 12 miles to the permanent prisoner facility outside Frankfurt. Under normal conditions, a half-day march. But with so many women barely able to walk, the column moved at a crawl, each step forward marked by grimaces of pain and occasional cries as damaged feet encountered sharp stones or frozen ground. The American guards who witnessed the march that morning found themselves confronting a humanitarian crisis that no military training had prepared them to handle. As the column slowly organized for the final leg of the journey, Sergeant Morrison walked the length of the formation, conducting what amounted to a medical inspection without proper medical authority or equipment. What he saw disturbed him deeply. A young German woman named Anna Schneider, barely 20 years old, stood trembling as she attempted to wrap torn strips of burlap around her feet. The makeshift bandages were already soaked through with blood from cuts that had reopened overnight. Her toes had taken on the waxy white appearance that Morrison recognized from winter warfare, training as second-degree frostbite, the kind of injury that could lead to permanent tissue damage or amputation if left untreated. Nearby, an older woman named Margaret Fischer tried to help 3 younger prisoners bind their feet with whatever materials they could scavenge. Margaret had worked as a hospital administrator before the war and understood the gravity of what she was witnessing. The infections spreading through open wounds, the frostbite damage, the simple exhaustion of bodies pushed beyond their limits. She knew that without immediate intervention, some of these women would not survive the remaining miles to Frankfurt. Corporal Stevens discovered a particularly heartbreaking scene at the rear of the column. A German woman named Elisabeth Braun, who had served as a telephone operator, sat on the ground unable to stand. Her feet were so swollen and damaged that they no longer fit into what remained of her shoes. She had attempted to walk barefoot the previous day, and the frozen mud had torn the skin from her soles in ragged strips. Every step was agony, yet 12 miles still stretched ahead. The 2 American medics, Corporal James Patterson and Private First Class Robert Martinez, moved through the column trying to provide what assistance their limited supplies allowed. They distributed the few remaining bandages, applied antiseptic to the worst infections, and identified women whose conditions had become critical. But bandages and antiseptic could not solve the fundamental problem. These women needed shoes, and shoes were precisely what the military supply system had never allocated for female prisoners. Private Chen found himself standing beside a mother and daughter, both barefoot and shivering in the morning cold. The mother, whose name he learned was Helga Richter, had given her own deteriorating shoes to her 17-year-old daughter Greta 2 days earlier, choosing to walk barefoot herself rather than watch her child suffer. Now, both walked without protection, Helga's sacrifice having only delayed rather than prevented their shared suffering. The sight of Helga's bleeding feet, damaged by her deliberate choice to protect her daughter, broke through Chen's careful adherence to emotional distance. He had maintained professional detachment throughout the war, following every regulation, never allowing himself to see enemies as individuals with families and stories. But watching a mother sacrifice her own well-being for her child transcended nationality and military protocol. Sergeant Morrison gathered his guards for a brief conference away from the prisoners. The situation was clear and the options limited. They could continue the march, accepting that some women would collapse and possibly die before reaching Frankfurt. They could request vehicle transport, knowing that no vehicles were available and that such a request would likely be denied. Or they could find another solution, one that no regulation or training manual had ever contemplated. The guards stood in a circle, young men far from home, looking at each other with expressions that mixed helplessness with determination. They had been trained to view prisoners as potential threats, requiring constant vigilance. They had been briefed on maintaining proper distance and never fraternizing with enemy personnel. But nothing in their training addressed what to do when the enemy was no longer an abstract concept, but specific individuals whose suffering was undeniable and whose humanity was impossible to ignore. Corporal Stevens was the first to speak the thought that several others were already considering. His voice was quiet but firm as he looked at Morrison and said words that would change everything. "Sergeant, we have spare boots. Most of us are carrying backup footwear in our packs. We could help them." The suggestion hung in the cold morning air, simultaneously obvious and revolutionary, practical and completely against regulations. Morrison stood silent for a long moment, weighing the implications of what Stevens had suggested. Military regulations were explicit about providing personal equipment to prisoners. Soldiers were responsible for maintaining their gear, and losing or giving away essential items could result in disciplinary action, even court-martial. Spare boots were not luxuries, but critical backup equipment that could mean the difference between operational effectiveness and injury during combat operations. Yet Morrison also understood that regulations had been written by officers who had never stood watching women bleed into frozen mud. The theoretical principles of prisoner management looked very different when confronted with the reality of human suffering that could be immediately alleviated. He thought about his sister in Detroit, about what he would want someone to do if she were the one walking barefoot through enemy territory. The decision came not as a dramatic announcement, but as a simple action. Morrison reached into his pack, pulled out his spare combat boots, sturdy leather footwear that had been issued specifically for winter conditions, and walked toward the column of prisoners. The other guards watched in stunned silence as their sergeant approached Elisabeth Braun, the woman who could no longer stand, and knelt beside her in the mud. Morrison's hands, roughened by years of military service, were surprisingly gentle as he examined Elisabeth's damaged feet. The woman flinched at first, expecting rough treatment or perhaps worse. Instead, the American sergeant carefully cleaned the worst of the mud from her feet using water from his canteen and a clean handkerchief from his pocket. Then, with movements that suggested both competence and compassion, he fitted his spare boots onto her swollen feet, adjusting the laces to accommodate the swelling. Elisabeth looked up at Morrison with an expression that combined disbelief, gratitude, and confusion. She had been taught that American soldiers were brutal occupiers, interested only in punishment and control. Yet here was an enemy sergeant sacrificing his own equipment to ease her suffering. Tears formed in her eyes as she tested the boots, finding that for the first time in days she could stand without excruciating pain. The effect of Morrison's action rippled through both the guards and the prisoners. Corporal Stevens immediately followed his sergeant's example, pulling his own spare boots from his pack and approaching Anna Schneider, the young woman whose frostbitten feet had shocked Morrison earlier. Stevens had been carrying these boots since the landing at Normandy, through France and into Germany, always as insurance against the failure of his primary footwear. Now he handed them to a German woman barely older than his own younger sister. Private Chen found himself facing the choice he had been contemplating since witnessing Helga Richter's sacrifice for her daughter. His commitment to regulation adherence, to proving his loyalty through perfect compliance, suddenly seemed less important than the opportunity to prevent further suffering. He removed his spare boots and approached Helga, whose eyes widened in surprise as the Chinese-American soldier knelt before her. The language barrier prevented detailed communication, but Chen's actions needed no translation. As he fitted the boots onto Helga's bleeding feet, he saw tears streaming down her face. The propaganda she had absorbed about American cruelty was dissolving with each gentle adjustment of the laces. Her daughter Greta watched in amazement, seeing her mother's pain finally acknowledged and addressed by someone who had every right to ignore their suffering. Within minutes, a chain reaction had begun. Guards who had initially hesitated, uncertain about violating regulations, found their resolve strengthened by the example of their sergeant and fellow soldiers. Private Martinez approached a group of 3 women, determining which one had the worst foot damage, and gave his spare boots to a former nurse named Sophie Weber, whose medical training made her recognize the significance of Martinez's choice. Corporal Patterson discovered that his spare boots were slightly too large for most of the women, but he found a solution by offering them to Margarete Fischer, whose feet were larger than average and whose organizational skills had been helping other prisoners throughout the march. Margarete accepted the boots with dignified gratitude, immediately understanding that her improved mobility would allow her to assist others more effectively. Not every soldier had spare boots to offer, and not every woman needed them equally. The guards began coordinating, identifying the prisoners with the most critical foot injuries and matching them with available footwear. Some soldiers gave up boots that didn't fit properly, accepting temporary discomfort for themselves to provide protection for prisoners who had nothing. The German women watched this unprecedented display of compassion with emotions that defied simple description. Everything they had been taught about their American captors was being contradicted by direct experience. These were not the monsters of propaganda, but young men who saw suffering and chose to help despite regulations and consequences. The transformation began immediately, though neither the American soldiers nor the German women fully understood what was happening in that moment. Anna Schneider took her first steps in Corporal Stevens's boots, testing her weight carefully on feet that had been screaming with pain just minutes before. The relief on her face was profound, but something else accompanied it. A confusion that ran deeper than gratitude, a cognitive dissonance that challenged everything she had believed about the enemy. Elisabeth Braun stood for the first time in hours, Morrison's boots transforming her from an invalid, unable to continue, into someone who could complete the journey. She looked at the American sergeant with an expression that mingled wonder and shame. Wonder at his unexpected kindness, shame that she had so thoroughly believed the lies about American brutality. Her voice, hesitant and halting in broken English, managed only 2 words that carried the weight of revolution. "Thank you." Morrison nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude, uncertain how to respond to emotion that crossed enemy lines. He had not given his boots seeking thanks or recognition. He had simply done what seemed necessary in the moment, what seemed human when confronted with suffering he could alleviate. Yet Elisabeth's tears and those 2 words affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. Throughout the column, similar scenes unfolded as German women adjusted to footwear that represented far more than physical protection. Helga Richter stood beside her daughter Greta, both now comprehending that the American soldiers were not the demons described in German propaganda. Private Chen's gift of his boots to Helga had created a bond that transcended language and nationality. Helga reached out and briefly touched Chen's arm, a gesture of connection that violated every protocol about prisoner-guard relationships, but felt more authentic than any regulation. The march resumed with a dramatically different atmosphere. Women who had been limping in agony or unable to walk at all now moved with relative comfort. The pace increased naturally as physical barriers to movement were removed, but more significantly, the emotional tenor of the column had shifted. German prisoners who had previously avoided eye contact with their guards now glanced at them with cautious curiosity rather than fear. Margarete Fischer, wearing Corporal Patterson's boots, found herself walking beside the young medic. She spoke some English from her work in hospital administration, and a tentative conversation began. Patterson learned about Margaret's 3 children currently staying with relatives in Bavaria, and her worry about their safety as the war drew to its chaotic conclusion. Margarete learned that Patterson had studied to become a teacher before the war, and hoped to return to that profession when peace finally came. These small exchanges, multiplied across the column as other guards and prisoners began communicating, represented a fundamental shift in how both groups perceived each other. The German women were discovering that their captors were individuals with families, dreams, and compassion. The American soldiers were recognizing that their prisoners were mothers, daughters, and ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Sophie Weber, the former nurse wearing Private Martinez's boots, used her medical training to assist the American medics with treating the remaining foot injuries. This collaboration, born from practical necessity, demonstrated that expertise and goodwill could transcend political divisions. Martinez found himself learning techniques from Sophie that his military medical training had never covered, practical field medicine developed through years of German wartime necessity. The soldiers who had given their boots now walked with only their primary footwear, accepting the risk that came with having no backup. If their current boots failed during future operations, they would face the same vulnerability they had just alleviated for the prisoners. Yet, none of them voiced regret. Private Stevens checked on Anna Schneider periodically, ensuring the boots were not causing new problems, and found satisfaction in seeing her walk without pain. The final miles to Frankfurt passed more quickly than anyone had anticipated. The improved pace meant they would arrive before nightfall rather than after dark as originally projected. More importantly, the atmosphere had transformed from grim endurance to something approaching cautious cooperation. Guards and prisoners were not friends, not yet, but they were no longer simply captors and captives. They had become, however temporarily, fellow travelers sharing a difficult journey. As the permanent prisoner facility came into view on the outskirts of Frankfurt, both groups faced an uncertain future. The German women would enter a camp where they might spend months or years awaiting final disposition. The American soldiers would return to their units, possibly facing questions about their missing spare equipment. But in that moment, approaching the gates at sunset, both groups carried something unexpected. A memory of humanity expressed across enemy lines, of compassion offered when regulation demanded indifference. The processing of prisoners at the Frankfurt facility took several hours, during which the unusual circumstances of their arrival became impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Henderson, the officer commanding the permanent camp, noticed immediately that a significant number of the newly arrived German women were wearing American military boots. Her initial assumption was that some unauthorized trade had occurred, perhaps prisoners bartering possessions for footwear from guards. The truth emerged during her debriefing with Sergeant Morrison. As he explained the march conditions and the decision to provide spare boots, Henderson found herself facing the same dilemma Morrison had confronted on the muddy road. Technically, the soldiers had violated regulations governing prisoner interactions and personal equipment accountability. Practically, they had prevented serious medical emergencies that would have overwhelmed the camp's limited medical facilities. Henderson made a decision that reflected both pragmatism and recognition of changing realities. Rather than initiating disciplinary proceedings, she documented the incident as a necessary medical intervention under extreme circumstances. Her report emphasized that the soldiers' actions had prevented injuries requiring extensive treatment and possible amputations, actually saving military medical resources. It was bureaucratic creativity in service of compassion, finding official justification for human decency. The German women settled into their new quarters, and the boots they wore became visible symbols of an experience that had fundamentally altered their understanding of their captors. Anna Schneider found herself explaining repeatedly to other prisoners how she had acquired American military boots. Each telling reinforced her own transformation from seeing Americans as enemies to recognizing them as individuals capable of extraordinary kindness. Elisabeth Braun, whose feet had been among the most severely damaged, became an informal spokesperson for what the prisoners began calling the March of Mercy. Her testimony about Sergeant Morrison kneeling in the mud to fit boots onto her injured feet spread through the camp, challenging the deeply ingrained propaganda that had shaped German perceptions of American soldiers for years. Word of the incident spread beyond the prisoner population. American personnel throughout the Frankfurt facility heard the story, and reactions varied. Some viewed the soldiers' actions as dangerous sentimentality that could undermine proper prisoner management. Others saw it as exemplifying the values that supposedly distinguished American forces from their enemies. But nearly everyone recognized that something significant had occurred, a moment when individual conscience had superseded institutional regulation. The boots themselves became cherished possessions. German women who had received them took meticulous care of the footwear, cleaning and maintaining the leather with an attention that went beyond practical necessity. These boots represented something larger than footwear. They were physical proof that enemies could choose mercy, that propaganda could be overcome by direct experience, that humanity persisted even in wartime. Margaret Fisher organized what amounted to an informal gratitude project among the prisoners. Women who had received boots began small acts of service within the camp, helping with food distribution, assisting in the medical ward, and maintaining order in their barracks. It was their way of honoring the kindness shown to them, of proving worthy of the sacrifice American soldiers had made. The soldiers who had given their boots returned to their units and faced various reactions from their fellow servicemen. Some were mocked for being soft on the enemy. Others were quietly admired for putting compassion ahead of regulation. Private Chen discovered that his action had enhanced, rather than diminished, his standing among his fellow soldiers, many of whom had questioned whether someone of Chinese descent could be truly American. His willingness to sacrifice for others, even enemy prisoners, proved his character in ways that rigid regulation compliance never could. Corporal Stevens received a letter several weeks later, delivered through official channels. It was from Anna Schneider, written in careful English with obvious assistance from someone more fluent. She thanked him for the boots and described how they had saved her feet from permanent damage. But more than that, she thanked him for teaching her that kindness could exist between enemies. The letter became Stevens's most treasured possession, carried through the remainder of the war and eventually home to Oregon. The impact extended beyond individual relationships. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson began implementing policy changes in prisoner management based partly on what she had observed. She authorized the acquisition of proper footwear for all prisoners, arguing successfully that preventing medical emergencies was more cost-effective than treating them. Her reports influenced broader Allied policy regarding prisoner welfare, contributing to improved conditions throughout the American occupation zone. The story reached journalists embedded with American forces, and several wrote articles about the march and the soldiers' sacrifice. These stories, published in American newspapers, provided counterbalance to propaganda portraying all Germans as irredeemable enemies. They reminded readers at home that war was fought between individuals, some of whom chose compassion, even when facing those they had been taught to hate. Within the Frankfurt camp, relationships between guards and prisoners evolved into something unprecedented in military prisoner management. The foundation of trust established by those boots enabled cooperation that made the facility safer and more efficiently operated than comparable camps. The winter of 1945 gave way to spring, and with it came the end of the European War. V-Day on May 8th brought celebrations across the Allied world, but in the Frankfurt prisoner camp, the moment carried complex emotions. For the German women, the formal end of hostilities meant confronting an uncertain future in a defeated nation. For the American guards, it meant transition from wartime protocols to occupation duties and eventual demobilization. The boots that had been given during that March remained on the feet of the women who had received them, now worn and weathered but still serviceable. These pieces of American military equipment had become something more symbolic than functional, representing the moment when enemies had become something else, something harder to define but easier to recognize as simply human. Elisabeth Braun made the decision to remain in the Frankfurt area after her release from the camp in June 1945. She found work helping to rebuild the city's damaged infrastructure and never forgot the sergeant who had knelt in the mud to give her his boots. Years later, when interviewed for a documentary about post-war reconciliation, she would describe that moment as the beginning of her understanding that peace was possible between former enemies. Anna Schneider emigrated to the United States in 1948, sponsored by a church group in Oregon that had read about her story in one of the wartime newspaper articles. By a remarkable coincidence, the church was in the same town where Corporal Stevens had returned after the war. Their reunion, covered by the local newspaper, became a symbol of reconciliation that resonated throughout the community. Anna eventually married an American veteran and raised her children teaching them that compassion transcends nationality. Helga Richter and her daughter Greta returned to their home village in Hesse to discover it mostly intact despite the war's destruction. Helga kept Private Chen's boots for the rest of her life, despite their eventual deterioration. She would show them to her grandchildren, explaining how an American soldier of Chinese descent had shown mercy to a German woman when he had every reason to show indifference or cruelty. The boots became a family heirloom, eventually donated to a museum documenting German-American reconciliation. Sergeant Morrison returned to Detroit after the war and fulfilled his promise to himself to check on his sister, who had worried about him throughout his service. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, but he often told the story of giving his boots to Elisabeth Braun. It became his way of explaining what he believed the war had ultimately been about, not hatred between peoples, but the struggle to preserve human decency in circumstances that constantly threatened to destroy it. The policy changes initiated by Lieutenant Colonel Henderson influenced broader American occupation strategy. Her reports demonstrated that humane treatment of prisoners actually enhanced security and cooperation rather than compromising it. These findings contributed to the development of post-war prisoner management protocols that emphasized basic human dignity alongside security requirements. Several of the soldiers who had participated in that March maintained correspondence with the German women they had helped. These letters, exchanged over decades, documented the rebuilding of Germany, the evolution of German-American relations, and the personal growth of individuals who had met as enemies and become unlikely friends. Private Martinez exchanged letters with Sophie Weber until his death in 1989, their correspondence spanning 44 years and covering everything from medical advances to the fall of the Berlin Wall. The boots themselves, those that survived beyond their practical utility, found homes in various museums and historical collections. The pair worn by Margaret Fisher was donated to the National World War II Museum, where they remain on display as part of an exhibition about reconciliation and humanitarian gestures during wartime. The accompanying placard tells the story of American soldiers who chose compassion over regulation. Educational programs developed around the story of the March and the boots. Schools in both America and Germany use it to teach students about the complexity of wartime relationships, the importance of individual moral courage, and the potential for reconciliation even between bitter enemies. The story challenges simplistic narratives about good versus evil, demonstrating instead that goodness can emerge in unexpected places and that enemies are often just people caught in circumstances beyond their control. The legacy extends beyond the specific individuals involved to influence broader cultural understanding. The story contributed to German recognition that not all Allied soldiers were vengeful conquerors, and to American recognition that not all Germans were fanatical Nazis. These nuanced understandings, built on countless individual encounters like the boot exchange, laid groundwork for the strong German-American alliance that developed during the post-war decades. Modern military training now includes case studies of incidents like the March, examining the tension between regulation and humanitarian response. Officers learn that rigid adherence to protocol can sometimes be less effective than flexible response to extraordinary circumstances. The story serves as a reminder that military effectiveness ultimately rests on maintaining the humanity of those who serve. Perhaps most significantly, the story endures because it speaks to fundamental questions about identity, morality, and choice. The soldiers who gave their boots were not saints or heroes in the traditional sense. They were ordinary young men who faced a moment of decision and chose compassion over convenience. Their choice did not end the war or change its outcome, but it changed lives and demonstrated that even in war's darkest moments, kindness remains possible.